Hello and welcome back to the Surfer's Library, proudly presented by Hillsborough Surf Club. I'm Billy Jack, your guide through the pages of surf history, culture, and legends. Aloha, my friends. I'm glad you've joined us again. This episode, we're going to continue reading Transcendental Memories of a Surf Rebel by Michael Lear Hinson and Donna Clausen-Jost. The book is always available on Amazon.com and EndlessDreamsPublishing.com if you'd like to add it to your own surf library. Also, if you want to help support the podcast, you can do so by visiting buymeacoffee.com/The Surfer's Library to do so. It helps cover the cost of producing the podcast each month, so any little bit will help. When we last left off, Mike had just lost his good friend and leader of the Brotherhood, Johnny Griggs. As a result, the Brotherhood began to fall apart, and Mike focused his energy on surfing. We pick up now on Chapter 47. Mike and his new friend John Gale are about to start a radical new surfboard company called Rainbow Surfboards. Let's paddle out. Chapter 47. Rainbow Surfboards. Thanks to JG's money and other financial backing, Rainbow Surfboards was up and running by the beginning of the 70s. I designed and shaped the boards. John Breeden and Starman airbrushed and glassed them. JG was our salesman, and Haley and John Hawthorne took care of business, doing everything from delivering the newly shaped boards to keeping the books. It was a well-oiled machine in more ways than one. What put Rainbow Surfboards on the map, says John Hawthorne, was having Mike as their shaper, but what created the demand was the talent of John Breeden and Starman Shields. Orange Sunshine also played a major role in Rainbow Surfboard's success. We were immersed in it, or maybe it was the other way around. Either way, we took 1,500 milligrams of acid every 3 days. We'd already experienced everything imaginable, including the crystallized stuff that you chop up into pieces. Put a little sliver of that on your tongue, and you'd blow yourself right off the street. We eventually moved up to liquefied acid and poured it into Visine bottles with vodka. That was so much more convenient. Everyone knows it's useless to drop every day, though. Like every other drug, our bodies build up an immunity. I did it so damned often, it didn't even affect me after a while. All I got was a slight tingling feeling. The four of us knew exactly how we wanted to paint the Rainbow Surfboards. We wanted designs that conveyed our world of psychedelics. Breeden and Starman laid out Buddha and its heart chakra, the sun the way you see it shining on acid, and the many colorful layers and filters that aren't seen by anyone unless you're experiencing. They basically painted the feeling of home we got when tripping out. There was an added bonus to Breeden's talent. Whenever you rode his boards on LSD and the water lapped up over the deck, the colors took on an entirely new dimension, expanding your trip even more. The evolution of techniques I used on airbrush boards occurred in those years, says John Breeden. Before that, it was not common to put the color directly on the foam or to color the whole board before glassing. It really was a time of discovery and rapid growth, painfully rapid sometimes, the bleeding edge. Mike's shapes were very avant-garde. We called him the Maharishi. He always had a cosmic explanation for why I should do something for him or why something had happened. Sometimes it was pretty wild to try and structure a serious business deal with Mike around. But the evolution of both the shapes and the color work was very exciting. And we had an audience of people who seemed to understand that it went beyond just making and riding surfboards. It was an event of cosmic importance. My two careers were providing enough cash to live a pretty decent but simple life. Other than our house, there wasn't much overhead. Melinda enjoyed our lifestyle. She never really knew the extent of my activities, nor did she want to know. She only wanted to experience the good side of both my careers. Life was one big dinner party to Melinda, and she worked hard at it. She could make anything into an event. She also did side jobs, modeling, dabbling in art direction, and redecorating our home. Melinda was happiest in her little cocoon when I left out the details. The Brotherhood definitely didn't need any more money. They smuggled for the thrill of it, and even though they tried to keep Johnny's beliefs alive, it just wasn't the same. The brothers were getting careless and greedy. They were clearly out for themselves. When Johnny was the leader, our trust was linked together in him. He was the glue. Without him, people began questioning each other's motives and began to fall off one by one. It's funny, the Brotherhood always had a code about staying out of trouble. Now it was the opposite. The brothers were even getting lazy about being pulled over by the police. I mean, everybody was aware the cops knew where everyone lived. But for some reason, they didn't stop to think about their behavior. Yeah, sure. If things got too heavy, they'd get out of town for a couple of days. Then as soon as the coast was clear, they'd be right back at it again. The truth was, if one went down, they were going to take the rest of them with them. The domino effect. After my near bust with Melinda a few years earlier, I never gave myself another chance to get caught. The slightest rumor made me go whoosh, and I was gone. Because the Brotherhood's dealings allowed them carte blanche in many remote places around the world, Johnny taught us to be as discreet as possible and keep the security level high. Unfortunately, now his rules are being swept under the rug. Like when their Afghanistan connection, the Tokis brothers, planned a trip to visit the Brothers, Disneyland, and Catalina one summer. When they landed at LAX, the guys actually sent a limo to deliver them to the canyon. Now let me ask you, if you ran a smuggling ring and two of your Middle Eastern suppliers came to visit, wouldn't you try to be more low-key? Man, these guys stuck out like sore thumbs. While I was extremely cautious business-wise, I didn't worry about my personal life so much. I never stood out in the middle of the street to tell the world what I was doing. But in certain situations, like at concerts, I'd let loose a little. JG and I were always on the same wavelength. Whenever we listened to music at local clubs, we'd bring freebies for the audience. LSD, Mexican pot, acid-laced orange juice. That's how we hooked up with Buddy Miles. Buddy popped onto the music scene way back with Wilson Pickett's Review, but he was Hendrix's drummer in the band of Gypsies when we met. Before I knew it, JG was supplying drugs for Buddy's shows. JG began providing drugs backstage at concerts way before then when he met a music producer who had heard about his ties with the Brotherhood. He even asked JG to bring refreshments to the Beatles' Hollywood Bowl stop. I wore my Levi jacket that night with a big marijuana leaf sewn on the back. I guess I was trying to make a statement because all the commotion about marijuana. Anyway, George Harrison came up to me out of the blue and told me he really liked my jacket, then disappeared. Since I helped JG, I was doling product out to backstage VIPs. When I heard the band being introduced, I saw the Beatles walk by on their way to the stage. I lifted the lapels of my jacket away from my chest and kind of motioned to George that it was his if he wanted it. No, he mouthed and shook his head, passing on my offer. I could almost hear him say it. I lifted the jacket away from my chest again, hoping he'd take me seriously the second time. Thank God. He smiled and nodded yes. What an honor to give George Harrison my jacket. I rushed to take it off and tossed it to him as he walked on stage. He wore it the rest of the night. Gearing up for the Flying Crowbar concerts, a local Laguna band Johnny and I sponsored, we'd start rolling joints on Wednesday and wouldn't stop until Friday night just before showtime. At first, it was easy to sneak joints in, but when they started beefing up security, we had to get creative. We knew we'd be frisked. Hell, we were practically on a first-name basis with the rent-a-cops. Patting us down, the closer those guys got to the pockets Melinda sewed into our shirt collars, the more we tried to act casual. Thank God they never looked under our hair. Ingenious. Since we traveled in packs, 3 or 4 of us could smuggle in at least 18 to 24 joints. Slipping inside, we'd get lost in the crowd, pull out our stash, light up, and pass the best weed north of the Rio Grande around the theater. It felt good and never illegal. It wasn't really dealing, now was it? We didn't make any money. It was more of a public service. Chapter 48. Making Movies. Rainbow Bridge was the name Chuck came up with for our movie, which was kind of a documentary about the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. You know, the whole communal feel. God, surfing, music, and drugs. The name came from the ancient Eastern concept, which is the bridge between the heart and the higher thought centers, or in Sanskrit, the Antakarana. Chuck also wanted to include the concept of the fear of the masses upon the arrival of extraterrestrial. I kind of dragged my feet on that one, but he finally persuaded me to go along with it. He was good at convincing people. My part of the deal was to make all the surfboards and bring together an A-list of surfers to meet us in Maui in May, which is where we decided to shoot most of the movie. It was probably the easiest money I was ever going to earn. Les Potts, BK, David, and Herbie came on board immediately. I didn't even have to talk them into it. I just picked up the phone and they were there for me. It was that simple. You have to remember that before this, surfers weren't paid very well for their work in movies and ads. I had a chance to change all that. Without batting an eye, I promised to treat my friends differently. I also learned years ago that there was a certain etiquette that came with the business. Now that I was handed this responsibility, I decided to make the movie a good experience for everyone. As a result, I established a standard of how surfers should be paid for stunt work in films. There was a bunch of us, says Dave Nueva, hanging out on High Avenue where Mike lived. One day Melinda said, "Oh yeah, I guess everything's a go on that Jimi Hendrix movie, Rainbow Bridge." How exciting. I mean, I was peaking in my surfing at that time that Jimi Hendrix was exploding on the rock and roll scene. I remember going to the Monterey Pop Festival and watching him when he first came on stage. I met Hendrix's manager, Michael Jeffrey, and blurted out, "I'd love to do the surfing parts." And off we went to Maui. I was so excited to participate in Rainbow Bridge. I think of that moment as, here's a guy that's the best guitar player in the world, and I just wanted to do the best surfing I ever could. I remember riding Ma'alaya Wharf and getting stung by a jellyfish right in the middle of a shot. Some of the guys getting out of the water said to everyone on shore, "Nueva's out there and he's on fire, keep out of his way." Little did they know, I kept surfing despite the sting. I remember the boards Michael made for me for that movie. They were all white and had stars on them. They were psychedelic, some of the most far-out boards I ever rode at that time. Anyway, I remember Maui, Hendrix, and riding in front of a 50-foot Buddha watching me surf. I knew Jimmy was going to plug in music behind my surfing, so I wanted to pour everything out. I know I did my best surfing during the shooting of that movie. Off we went to Maui for 3 weeks. Our film crew shot great footage at Breakwall, Mala, and a small Ma'alaya. Honolulu was also small the day we shot less. We chose Lahaina Breakwall at Ma'alaya for David, hoping to raise awareness against the Army Corps of Engineers who were planning to expand the harbor. All we wanted to do was preserve freight trains, the fastest and longest ride in the world. It wasn't even a good place for a harbor. I mean, the wind blew the boats all over the place. With the surfing sequences in the can, we flew back home to watch the dailies and edit the film. But before we left, we put the word out to the local surfers that we'd be back in a month. It was Rainbow Bridge, Ma'alaya, and Michael Lear Hinson. Raw energy. End of story, says Herbie Fletcher. Chapter 49. Happy Days. In the middle of all the commotion, Melinda and I decided to get married. We really were happy with the way things were. We'd been together for over 5 years, living together for the last 3. But there weren't a lot of unmarried couples shacking up in 1970, and we never stopped to think that it bothered anybody until we heard that Melinda's grandmother, Michael Lavender, was upset. Melinda casually said to me one day, "Let's make Grandma Michael happy. Let's get married and throw a party." I agreed. I scheduled almost everything in our lives around my numerology number 3. For our wedding day, we chose Sunday, June 28th, because it was my birthday. I was turning 28, and I was born on Sunday. 3 things. Even our mortgage payment was $333. The ceremony was held in the garden of Betty Keith Carey and her husband Trig Carey's home on the La Jolla Country Club golf course. Melinda wore an Elizabethan gown with antique lace that she designed and made herself. Her long brown hair was pinned up with daisies, and she had soft curls falling down around her large dark eyes. She was gorgeous. Bambi, her maid of honor, wore a dress she borrowed from Michael Jeffrey's girlfriend, Lynn, and Melinda made the bridesmaids' gowns. Oh yeah, and all the women went barefoot. My best man was Phil Edwards. He wore a gray suit, and mine was a cranberry velvet Edwardian dinner jacket with velvet slippers instead of leather shoes to protest the slaughter of animals. Melinda decorated the 20-foot-high hedges in the backyard with porcelain doves, oriental banners, and flags bearing Eastern and Western symbols of the universal unity. The flags were going to be shipped over to Maui to use in the Rainbow Bridge movie, and the lawn around the patio had multicolored Indian lanterns and elephant umbrellas. Our 2 families were with us. Melinda's mother, grandmother, and father, plus my parents, my brother Richie, and 70 of our closest friends, including Chuck, Pat Hartley, Barry DePrendergast, Richard Chase, Melissa Montgomery, and her husband David Lee Burke, Lance Jost, and surfing buddies Mike Doyle, Diff, Corky, his wife Cheryl, and Mickey. The ceremony started at 3:33 in the afternoon. Facing one another, we read passages from ancient scriptures while a harpist played in the background. We made up our own vows, recalls Melinda, because I refused to say I will obey or until death do us part or any of that nonsense. Instead, we promised to experience life together and be in the now. Melissa and David Lee Burke brought the wedding cake down from Help, a Los Angeles health food restaurant who used Melinda's special recipe with ground hashish as the secret ingredient. Everyone had a high old time. When we left the reception, we were showered with brown rice. Then we walked the 8 blocks home in full wedding attire. A few of our guests followed us up to our attic where we smoked our brains out. Chapter 50. Here and Now Creations. We arrived in the parking lot at Seabury Hall on Maui the first week of July with wedding guests in tow. Our honeymoon was a great excuse to keep the party going, so we invited as many friends as possible to join us in shooting Rainbow Bridge. Seabury, a private live-in girls' school located just above Haiku in Makawao Valley, closed down every summer for 3 months. The grounds of the massive girls' school included a main house with a living room, a kitchen, a large dining room, separate bungalows, tennis courts, a swimming pool, ponds, and horses spread out on 600 manicured acres overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Thanks to our $500,000 budget, we had the best health food kitchen in the world. I swear, you name it, you could get anything to eat at any time of day or night from our vegan chef who flew over from Hollywood to run the kitchen. Turned out, the chef was the grandson of Seabury's original owner. What a coincidence. We did everything together. Ate, watched films, did Tai Chi and yoga on the lawn, and we discussed current events. It was the real new age, man, completely communal. An invisible maze of the brotherhood was also there with a religious undertow. And drugs were passed around nonstop. The maze was actually some of the members who were now living on Maui. JG was not one of them. He couldn't risk showing his face in the movie and played it safe by staying home. Thanks to Warner Brothers, this was the real deal, a major Hollywood production. Negotiations with the studio gave Chuck and his partner Barry de Pendergrass at Antakarana Productions complete control over the cast and crew selection. Richard Chase, associate producer and our cameraman friend from Solana Beach, put together 35 top-notch professionals, enlisting the help of cinematographer Vilas Lepanix, the man who caught Bobby Kennedy's assassination on film at the Ambassador Hotel in 1968, Alan Stensvold, second unit photography, John Goodwin, Johnny Matsumoto, and Eddie Schreier, who would shoot the Hendrix concert. Thomas Goodwin was Chuck's assistant director, and John Bushelman came on as sound editor. Bushelman had been in Hollywood for 20 years editing, directing, and producing. Chuck hired Bambi as the script supervisor. Like I said, I did the surfing coordination with Paul Gebauer's help, and Melinda was art director. She really got into it. Months before we even left for Maui, Melinda sewed pillows and collected set decorations. She acquired so many props she had to send them all ahead on a boat. I introduced artist Lance Jost to Michael Jeffrey to see if he could design the artwork for the movie title. Lance was an unbelievable talent who was perfect for the job. Before Melinda and I got married, Mike Haley brought Lance down to our house in La Jolla for dinner to meet Jeffrey. Once he saw Lance's portfolio, though, he was so impressed he asked him to paint a mural for Hendrix's new studio, Electric Lady, instead. While we were all over in Maui for the summer, Lance was getting ready to take off for New York. Props and set decoration, check. Cameras, check. Director, check. We were ready to roll, except for one glitch. Chuck didn't have a script. The script is one of the most important tools in making a movie. Not only do the actors use it to learn their lines, but it's also a guide for camera, lighting, and sound setup. This left a lot of people at Seabury confused, but not Chuck. I mean, this guy kept up with Andy Warhol, for God's sake. He'd already made about a dozen films back in New York. He also worked with Otto Preminger, who praised him for writing the best dialogue he ever read. Plus, it wasn't like he didn't have anything. Except for a few screens written down, the rest was all in his head. Everything was instinctive with Chuck. The plot of the movie focused on Chuck's friend, Pat Hartley. Pat was a petite woman with a wild afro and great to have around. No ego at all. I loved hanging out with her. Chuck met Hartley back when she was a student at the Performing Arts High School in New York City. He was living on 47th Street at the Americana, and his apartment was also the meeting place for their little clique. From there, they'd all go off and club around until 4 or 5 in the morning. Andy Warhol and Chuck cast Hartley, Edie Sedgwick, and Debbie Hansen, better known as the mother of musician Beck, when they made the movie Prison. When Chuck was filling roles for Rainbow Bridge, he knew he needed someone different, a mulatto chick that wouldn't buy the whole new age way of living. Harley fit the bill to a T. On July 7th, the first day of shooting, I was in my cabin at Seabury, recalled Chuck, and a vision of my brother, Ronnie, appeared in my room surrounded by this strange light. Ronnie had been diagnosed with cancer, but was now in remission. Then in May, they told him he had 2 months to live. Ronnie was living in Tijuana, Mexico, undergoing Laetrile, when I flew over to Maui. 10 minutes after I saw my brother's apparition, I got the call. Ronnie had died. Scene 1, the only developed scene in the movie. Pat flies into Los Angeles and meets millionaire Bruce Baxter in the airport. That scene was actually shot in Honolulu a few days before we hopped the inner island for Maui. Bruce's character owns an estate on Maui at the base of Haleakala. He mentions to Pat that his home has been taken over by a band of religious hippies, and he needs someone to keep them in line while he travels the world. Bruce instantly senses Pat has the huevos to take care of things, that she wouldn't be distracted by sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and offers her the job. She's hired and sent over to Hawaii. Scene 2 was the first footage actually shot at Seabury. Pat arrives at the mansion. Melinda greets her riding a horse bareback. Not a stretch. Melinda grew up riding horses at her family's ranch in Arizona. Not only did she do her own stunts, she looked beautiful doing them, her long brown hair flowing in the wind. Melinda had a few other scenes in Rainbow Bridge. She didn't ask to be in it, but Chuck needed someone to balance Hartley's character. He liked the way she handled herself. A cast began appearing all on its own. Meanwhile, Chuck searched for action. Baron Bingen pushed his way to the front of the line as the bad guy. He was tall and thin with long white hair and a beard. He looked a lot like Dwayne Allman in the Allman Brothers Band. According to Baron, he was the most beautiful man in the world. He was cocky and full of shit, and that wasn't when the cameras were rolling. Chuck met Baron down in Acapulco after he left Guadalajara and invited him to come over to Maui. Everyone except Chuck pretty much despised Baron from the beginning and wondered why he let such an asshole hang around. According to Chuck, we needed people like him with his big ego and all. He was the guy who would stand up and do anything we asked. The only thing that's really interesting around here is when people argue, Chuck blurted out while we were sunning ourselves around the pool and smoking a joint. That really got us thinking. A lot of people at Seabury were pissed off at Chris Green most of the time. He was always shooting his mouth off. He told Melinda she'd go to hell if she kept smoking. What an idiot. So to create some drama, Chuck set up a scene with Chris and crew member Luke Hines. The first take began when Chris sat up against a wall on a bed and started massaging Luke's back with an electric device. What Chris didn't know was Luke was a homosexual, a small black man who kind of gave off the vibe, if you know what I mean. He also didn't know that it was a complete setup, man. Everyone knew it except Chris. Luke put his hand on Chris's leg like he was hitting on him. I could see where Luke might be attracted to Chris if Chris kept his mouth shut long enough. He was a good-looking guy, tall, thin, tan, and sandy brown hair, but definitely not gay. Very calmly, Chris brushed his hand off and told him the Bible says homosexuality is a sin. Chuck kept encouraging Luke to touch Chris's leg again and again, with Chris brushing him off until the scene ended with the two guys ready to have it out. Pitting people against each other definitely juiced up the film. Whenever we found anyone heavy in discussion about their beliefs, we'd report it to Chuck and he'd film the scene completely ad-libbed. A lot of egos clashed on camera. It was the first of its kind, reality filmmaking. To create even more confrontation, Chuck invited a group of New Age individuals who had a variety of opinions about life. Benny Harrison read a trumped-up astrological chart just to piss Melinda off. He talked about bogus negative traits of a double Scorpio while she floated around on a surfboard in a swimming pool. Benny learned something very important from that reading: never piss Melinda off. Tai Chi instructor Marty Chin gave a class early each morning on the grounds of the school. Stanley Burroughs, a healer who came up with a cure-all made from lemons, turned into kind of a lech when he tried to relieve Hartley's aches and pains after yoga class by feeling her up. Teresa Pinter wanted to join the nuns at Seabury and didn't want anything to do with drugs or alcohol. When Paul Gebauer told her that taking acid would bring her closer to God than she could ever imagine, she tried it and found out he was telling the truth. Claire Schoof, a fortune teller from Germany, and Dr. Emanuel Bronner were also there. Dr. Bronner was the guy who put Castle Soap on the map. I met him years before and loved hearing his life stories as a Jewish-German refugee during the Nazi regime. He was also Albert Einstein's nephew and an environmentalist before it was a fad. He manufactured his wonderful soap as a messenger for his vision of universal truth and spent his entire adult life searching for God. One thing Chuck intentionally wanted in the movie was to show drugs being smuggled in surfboards. I fought him on this one. I wasn't sure I wanted everyone to know about my business, but Chuck insisted. He told me how important it was. He also promised not to shoot it without my permission. Feeling pressured, I finally gave him the go-ahead. I just didn't want to be the one up on the screen carrying out the dirty deed. After mulling it over for a while, I figured, what's the big deal? I wasn't the first or last surfer to smuggle dope. Basically, the camera crew was on call day and night. Over the course of 1 week, the set turned into such a collaborative effort. Brainstorming was going on in every corner of the estate. Chuck welcomed ideas from everybody. To date, this was the most creative atmosphere I've ever been in. If someone came up with a suggestion that was usable, he'd work it in. He really made everyone feel like they were contributing. When Michael Jeffrey walked through the front door at Seabury near the end of July, followed by Jimi Hendrix and his entourage, everybody was speechless. Jimmy and I shook hands. This was definitely the kick in the pants we needed to keep the momentum going for our movie, but it took a few minutes for it to soak in that I was actually meeting Hendrix. The first time you meet your hero, you expect him to be completely dynamic. I was blown away at how quiet he was. He was the guy next door, as normal as they come, not the legend I saw rocking out on stage. Everybody was really cool about meeting Hendrix. Didn't want to scare the poor guy off, did we? Nobody got too gushy, except maybe Les. He was so excited he invited Jimmy to go surfing with us. What a bizarre thing to ask Jimi Hendrix. Actually, I kind of wish I'd have thought of it until Michael Jeffrey reminded me he couldn't afford to get hurt. Jimmy apologized and was led up to his room. Although he rented a house over by the airport, when Jimmy was filming at Seabury, he stayed upstairs in the main house. The surfboard smuggling scene took place in Jimmy's rehearsal room. Les and I are lying on the floor hanging out when Alan Shubin comes in and tells me to cut open the surfboard he carried in. Acting like we're surprised, we watch him pull out a bag of hash, which was really Ovaltine. The scene ends as we light up a bowl and a puff of smoke floats up in front of a poster of Richard Nixon that reads, "Would you buy a used car from this man?" The best thing about being around Jimmy was I got to know him as a person, not just as an idol. He'd sit in his room for hours and practice his guitar. When Billy Cox and Mitch Mitchell arrived, they set their equipment up and rehearsed some of their new songs. "We'll go through that 3 times, Jimmy would say after he played one all the way through for the boys. When I asked Jimmy to think up a scene for the movie, says Melinda, he told me, "I'm going to be dead. I'm not even going to be here." Our eyes locked for a few seconds and I knew he spoke the truth. It was dead silence until he finally laughed. "Now let's play some music." "Quiet on the set," Chuck yelled, and the cameras began to roll on one of Jimmy's ideas. "And action." He pointed upstairs. Dressed in a white suit and a bright tie, Barron stood on one of Seabury's balconies and tried looking presidential. Now that was going to take some acting. He followed Chuck's direction and started to drone on, and just like a typical politician, he didn't stop. Boy, that guy loved to hear himself talk. I'm sure letting Barron run wild with the scene was part of Chuck's plan. Keep him talking until he annoys everyone to shit. Just then, Jimmy leaned out of a window near his bedroom, pulled out a rifle, and pretended to blast Barron away. "Okay, coffee break's over," Jimmy yelled. "Now get back on your goddamn heads." Jimmy was really anxious to try surfing, only for the pure pleasure of the feeling. He loved the uncontrollable nature of its expression, but we both knew it was impossible. I did take him out paddling around in the ocean, though. As it turned out, I was glad I didn't teach him how to surf because when we were coming out of the water, he slipped on the rocks and cut his foot on some coral. Nothing serious, but he went to the hospital anyways to have it bandaged. When he got back to Seabury, we wrapped it up even better to buy him more time. He canceled his trip to London and hobbled around Maui for a few more days with a cane that he made out of driftwood. Chuck and Hartley were alone at the beginning of the attic scene when Hendrix walked up high as a kite. Jimmy was high most of the time at Seabury. He called it the Cosmic Candy Store. Chuck began by asking him if he'd ever been in a pyramid, and Jimmy talked about Florida and past lives. Then Chuck asked him if he ever ran into anybody from the 3rd grade. Jimmy said no. He always had to sit next to his teacher because he told her he was from Mars. Jimmy spiraled after that, and the conversation jumped around from soldiers dying in the water hole of the Oasis to banana cream pie and an affair he had with Cleopatra. It took Chuck a couple of days to actually shoot the scene, mainly because Jimmy was too out of it to make it up to the attic, but it was well worth the wait when he finally did. "You could say Jimmy was depressed when he arrived at Seabury," said Chuck, "but after being in the islands a few days, he began to rejuvenate. To keep on schedule, I had to come up with an idea to kill time. For some reason, the rafters in the attic reminded me of a Viking ship, so I had 8 or so people sit between the rafters and Barron led them rowing an imaginary ship. Although it didn't make any sense in the dailies, when we returned to the mainland, I planned on getting some movie footage of Vikings rowing from the 20th century studios. Warner Brothers was getting antsy. They were desperate to communicate and kept hassling Chuck for footage. They did have $500,000 invested, but Chuck was involved in every aspect of the filming, including the upcoming Hendrix concert. He didn't really have a minute to think about the studio. As a half-assed attempt to get them off his back, Chuck, Jimmy, Melinda, and a few of the crew members sat in on the dailies in the chapel at Seabury. Jimmy and I sat in the front pew, says Melinda. He fiddled with his guitar and said when he returned to New York, he was going to run the surf footage and let the surfers write the music by the way they rode the waves. When they took off, he'd take off. When they carved down the face, he'd carve down the strings of the guitar. And when they flew off the lip, he'd fly off the lip. He envisioned the surfers scaling down a musical staff as if they were the notes. Jimmy's concert took place on a stage built just below Haleakala, on a flat mesa known to the locals as Rainbow Ridge. Our first choice was up on the Haleakala crater. After we thought about it, though, we realized that there could be an eco-disaster. Didn't want to piss off the gods, now did we? So we called a friend of Potts and Melinda's, Ben Baldwin, whose father was a board member at the Haleakala Dairy, and talked him into letting us use the pasture below the crater for the concert. He had only one condition: don't disturb the cows. Designing the stage, Melinda used as many of Jimmy's ideas as possible, including research on color sound healing by Terrain, a therapist who had decoded Jimmy's music with color vibrations. For the back of the stage, Melinda brought the flags from home that we had used in our wedding that designated the Piscean Age, and the front of the platform was covered with silk fabrics and flags with the 12 zodiac signs on bamboo poles, each with their corresponding color. At some point in coordinating Jimmy's concert, we realized we needed more people. We invited a lot of friends to Seabury, but the size of the crowd wasn't impressive enough for a movie. So Michael Jeffrey used the Coconut Wireless and asked for volunteers to drive through the streets of Lahaina with posters that read, "Whoever wants to see a free Hendrix concert, come to Rainbow Ridge for the Rainbow Bridge Vibratory Color Sound Experiment on July 30th. The day of the concert finally arrived. Everything had been well planned out and we were ready. The only thing we didn't take into account was the weather. If you've ever been to the islands, it can rain at the drop of a hat. There doesn't have to be a cloud in the sky. Then from out of nowhere, the trade winds blow them through and it's pouring. Luckily, we didn't have to worry about random showers during Jimmy's concert, but because we were at such a high elevation, the wind ended up causing a shitload of problems. Man, it was loud. It was so loud that the wind made it almost impossible to hear. We tried everything, even covering the microphones with foam rubber from the instrument cases didn't work. We had every sound technician and extra hand working feverishly to find a solution in time for the concert. It wasn't like this was an issue we could overlook. The sound quality couldn't be half-assed. This was a live concert. In the meantime, a bus was sent down to Lahaina twice to pick up people and drop them off at the base of the volcano. As they hiked the 4 miles to Rainbow Ridge, I stood up above on the edge and watched a steady stream of people running, skipping, and holding hands. Once the crowd of over 800 reached the top, they were seated astrologically on the grass. Local folk singers, the Gemini Twins, opened the show with "I Believe in God." The twins, who wore rainbow-colored silk dresses, were a couple of nice young kids, but they weren't the reason the crowd trekked 4 miles uphill. Jimmy and his band hung out in a tent we set up next to the stage, and the audience got a high on mostly LSD and hash. Then Chuck walked on stage. "Welcome, cosmic brothers and sisters of Maui, to the Rainbow Bridge Vibratory Color Sound Experiment," said Chuck. "We're here for a very, very particular purpose, I think that applies to all our brothers and sisters across the planet. The Rainbow Bridge is not just a bridge. Just as there are cells that make up our body, we are cells in the body of the planetary being. And the purpose of the humanity for being on this planet is to build that bridge between the heart and the higher mental and spiritual centers of the planetary being. And every higher thought and every higher action that each of us participates in builds that bridge. And the reason that we've all kind of dropped out to here, and it's the first time that anybody's dropped out in any large numbers since the Christians dropped out of Rome, then we want to carry that vibe to everyone else. So instead of just kind of being a receptive audience and have what we have at every law-abiding concert forever and ever up to now, if we just turned on our energies so Jimmy can pick into that and lead us across that bridge, then everybody in the world is going to pick up on that. So we're all counting on you, and here's your chance. And Jimmy should be here in a few minutes. Thank you." The crowd owned as Chuck walked off. Then Jimmy and the boys came out of the tent and climbed the stairs onto the stage. This was what we were all waiting for. Every time I saw Jimmy, he absolutely blew me away. But this was so much better. This was something I actually had a hand in. Chuck was the guy who really put it all together along with everyone else down at Seabury. But I played a part in it. And even better, Jimi Hendrix, my friend, was up there, not just my idol. Before jumping into their first set, Jimmy dazzled the crowd with coding music, colors, and astrological signs. He played each color of the zodiac on his guitar, then strung them into a melody. At first, it sounded like cellos, then violins, and just before it came together as a full-blown orchestra. I thought I heard a harp. Wearing a Navajo-inspired shirt with conches that was designed by Terrain, he started singing Spanish Castle Magic. Technically speaking, the concert went pretty well. 4 roaming cameras filming at once was Chuck's idea. It was the audio that was the challenge. Amps were cutting in and out because of the wind, and microphones weren't providing the sound quality we needed. There was definitely a kinetic force working against us. Hopefully, the gods were getting off on the music and not angry about our being there. Even the foam-covered mics weren't enough to drown out all of the wind. It just kept howling across the ridge. Creatively, though, Jimmy's performance was one of his best ever. "I'd like to dedicate this next song to that little girl over there, Hartley," Jimmy introduced Pat. "It's called Foxy Lady. Plug your ears, it's gonna be loud." Driving up to Haleakala with Jimmy in his rental car the day before the concert, we talked about starting a communal media center, the essence of our lives, where it was going, and what it all meant to him. But I was totally blown away when he told me he wanted to play his music louder. He was already pushing past the 7th decibel, man. When Jimmy played Foxy Lady on the guitar with his teeth, everyone jumped to their feet and didn't sit down until he was all the way through the next song, Fire. Dolly Dagger started off the second set, and in the middle of Stone Free, a young girl jumped up on the stage and danced for the crowd. Jimmy was so distracted he forgot the words. Finally, after 3 hours and a cranking version of Hey Joe, Jimmy and the guys wrapped it up and walked off the stage. Jimmy left to play the Honolulu International Center the next day on August 1st, says Melinda. This was his last American concert. Then he returned to Maui for 2 more weeks. Playing music for hours on end at his vacation rental by the airport, he re-energized himself for his European dates. I won the American flag shirt off his back in a heated game of ping pong. When Jimmy left for good, I told him I'd come to New York in September to decorate Electric Lady Studio. His response was odd. He gave me another strange look like the one a week earlier. "I won't be there. I won't be here," he said in a monotone voice. I gave him the biggest hug I could. Melinda and Michael Jeffrey took Jimmy to the airport on August 13th, 1970. They watched him jet off to New York in his private plane as he pointed up to a rainbow in the sky. Chapter 51. End of a Rainbow. It was a mess wrapping things up on Maui. Rainbow Ridge cleared out and the crew flew back to Hollywood. A few of us stayed behind to take down the stage, clean up, and try to leave Seabury the way it was when we arrived. When we were ready to head out for the airport, we stood outside the gate. I'll admit, I got kind of choked up. The party's over, I thought, as the last 7 weeks flashed in my head. We made new friends. Jimmy wrote a song about Melinda called Scorpio Woman. Chuck wrote, produced, and directed a feature-length film, and Barron broke out with a rash from his all-mango diet. Now all we had to do was walk away. Everything was the same when we got home, except that we had a movie to edit. I don't think it really hit me until we landed in San Diego. We just spent our honeymoon hanging out with Hendrix. What a trip. Chuck moved up to LA as soon as we got back home and rented an apartment with Barry. John Schreier, an editor from Warner Brothers, hopped on board and really gave the process some direction and balance. Without him, the film would have been doomed. Neighbors were also in and out of the apartment on a regular basis, including a little-known actor named Don Johnson who lived in the back. Don Johnson hadn't made a name for himself quite yet, said Chuck, although he was heading in that direction. He just finished filming a movie called Zachariah, a Western about 2 gunfighters on a journey, and invited me over for a wrap party at his place. The living room was packed with celebrities and future stars Jack Nicholson, Goldie Hawn, Judy Carn, Mama Cass and John Phillips, and the Monkees and their manager. Melanie Griffiths started hanging out around that time also. She was only about 15 years old, but very mature for her age. What a sweet kid. I'll always remember Don as being very instrumental in helping us distribute the movie. He was a great asset. I drove up the I-5 as much as I could to watch the editing. Melinda and I had a vested interest. 5% of the profits was nothing to squawk about. Thanks to the studio, we ended up spending $900,000 plus to shoot the 6-hour movie. Chuck knew he had to get it down to a reasonable length, but it was everywhere, hanging off the furniture, piling up on the floor, laying in between mugs of cold tea and half-burnt incense sticks. He anguished over every piece of footage. Finally, after the first cut, he got it down to 3 hours and 20 minutes. On September 19th, 1970, I was back home after an all-nighter up in LA. I was finally in bed and getting some shut-eye when I kept hearing the radio blasting in the other room. "What are you doing?" I remember yelling at Melinda. No one answered. Why did she have to have it so loud? She turned it up again. Jimi Hendrix was only 27 years old when he passed away in his sleep last evening in London, the DJ reported. He choked on his own vomit and never woke up. I went into shock mode. I was dreaming, right? It had to be a mistake. The film wrapped just 5 weeks before. This couldn't be happening. I jumped out of bed and threw my clothes on as fast as I could while Melinda cried. Jimmy flew straight to New York from Maui for the grand opening of his recording studio. He'd been looking for a space to open a nightclub for 2 years, but switched his plan to a recording studio when he found the old Village Barn building in Greenwich Village. Jimmy began converting the first floor of the building into 2 studios in 1970. After the opening, he was going to Europe for a few concert dates while Lance started painting the Electric Lady mural. "I can't remember where I was going," says Lance Jost, "but I ran into a friend on the street 3 days before I was supposed to take off for New York. 'Hey, did you hear Jimi Hendrix died?' he asked. I was in shock." Pretty hectic. Jimmy's life was non-stop. That's why I think Seabury did him a world of good. He drank, smoked, dropped, and played music. He even talked about visiting the ranch at Idlewild. He thought it was a potential location for our communal media center. More than anything, though, we found out that Jimi Hendrix was a real human being. No head trips. If someone knocked on your door, he'd be the one to get up and answer it. Jimmy's body wasn't even cold when meetings were scheduled to discuss the film. We still had a deal with Michael Jeffrey, but if we didn't pay back the studio, they were going to make the Dead Hendrix movie. In other words, they wanted control. Besides cutting the film down to nothing, our only problem up until that point was paying everyone their fair share. Now we had to deal with corporate America, and it wasn't going to be pretty. Turned out, Warner Brothers only underwrote the movie because of the soundtrack's potential. They never banked on Rainbow Bridge being completed. If they didn't like what Chuck came up with, the film would be shelved. If it showed promise, it would be distributed. And if it was a hit, the studio would take full credit. The first thing on Warner Brothers' agenda was for Chuck to cut the film's length down again. The suits were being completely unreasonable. Chuck even had to fight to keep in some of the best surfing sequences you'll ever see captured in 35mm film. The coordination alone that went into getting everyone from California to Maui just to catch a good swell at Malaya was epic. Our political agenda was also an issue with the studio. It's not like Hollywood never ruffled any feathers. But if you notice, everything we said happened, didn't it? Including Nixon's impeachment. The studio execs didn't care. All they were really interested in was cashing in on Jimmy's name. Dr. Bronner got axed completely. It was like he never even came to Maui. And the airport scene where Bruce Baxter hired Hartley, that was also cut. How pointless can you get? That left everybody in the dark about why this chick showed up at Seabury in the first place. Worst of all, the concert was edited to shreds. It was Chuck's dream to make the first ever filmed rock concert, but Warner Brothers couldn't see it. This was one of Jimmy's best performances, and Chuck was only allowed to show 17 minutes. He had no say whatsoever. If the studio was going to handle the distribution, Chuck had to get it down to a measly 108 minutes. What a waste. Taking a breather from the chaos, I was walking past Wind and Sea parking lot one day, wondering who was going to bail us out. Just then, Buzzy Bent cruised by in his Porsche. He rolled down the window. "What's up, Michael?" I hadn't seen Buzzy in months. He'd been jet-setting ever since he opened the chart house with Joey. You know, fast cars, women, etc. I jumped in the passenger seat and we went flying up Bon Air and Nautilus, headed toward Mount Soledad. Neither of us said a word. We both just leaned back as we drove by La Jolla High School in the middle of a gear change to second. Pulling up to the side of the road overlooking La Jolla shores, Buzzy lit up and said, "You were saying, Michael?" In a couple of minutes, I explained the whole movie deal to him, and in the end, it was my old surfing pal who came to our rescue. Buzzy basically picked up the ball and threw it back into play by paying off the whole debt. Years later, I heard he sold his rights to Rhino for $1 to avoid splitting the profits with his ex-wife. Dealing with the studio wasn't the only hassle in my life. Melinda still insisted on going to New York to decorate Jimmy's studio. She really wanted to pursue a career in art direction and interior design, and the movie gave her the boost she needed to get it on track. Having a commission from Hendrix on her resume could open a lot of doors. Then it got worse. Melinda told me I was the best, open-minded friend she could possibly ask for, but, she reminded me, we agreed not to include the words, "I will obey," or "till death do us part," in our vows. According to her, as partners and friends, we would go on to the next steps of our journey to go through the process of growing old together. We didn't own each other. Then she added that the day after the wedding, I subconsciously woke up and said, "You're mine." I have to tell you, I felt like I was hit on the side of the head with a baseball bat. I was completely blindsided. We'd been together all this time, and only after 2 months of marriage she wanted out. Where was this all coming from? I did not want my wife running around New York with her jet-set crowd. Get her back in that scene and she might never come home. Everything after that was crazy, kind of a blur. Any projects involving Jimmy came to a screeching halt. I mean, they hit the fucking brick wall. After the initial shock of his death wore off, Melinda was on the phone. She called everybody and anybody who could tell her what was going on. Chuck, Michael Jeffrey, the studio. We all had our own way of dealing with Jimmy's death. Melinda made it clear she needed to get away. She finally got the go-ahead from Jimmy's family before she left with Chuck for his funeral in Seattle. This was her thing, so I decided to give her some space and didn't go. As soon as she got back from Seattle, though, she split for New York. I think the jet engine was still warm. She stayed with Michael Jeffrey and Lynn at their apartment while she prepared to decorate the studio's offices. Trying to keep my marriage working from 3,000 miles away wasn't going to be easy. The odds weren't good. Chuck also flew to New York to dub the soundtrack at Jimmy's studio. Charlie Backus and his buddies mixed in the singing Krishnas in Laguna, and Chuck matched up the surfing shots with Jimmy's recorded songs Room Full of Mirrors for Les's surfing sequence at Honolulu Bay, Look Over Yonder for my rides at Maalaya, and Easy Rider played in the best scene of the film, David Nueva at Maalaya with Herbie in the background. I phoned Michael 3 months into my stay, says Melinda, and told him I wasn't coming home. I had resumed my life in New York and was getting a number of high-profile decorating commissions. At the end of our conversation, I promised him I'd come back for the premiere. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it and that you'll join us again next week as we continue reading from Mike Hinson, Transcendental Memories of a Surf Rebel. Until then, keep your toes on the nose, your bottom turns tight, and your stoke high. I'll see you in the lineup.